In Part 2, our recreation of the Journey of the Bulk Challenge continues. In Part 1, we exposed the interconnections of events that drove thousands of people to the Freeport of Monrovia in a desperate attempt to escape the carnage of April 6, 1996.
Stay tuned as we piece together the events unfolding at the Freeport of Monrovia before the departure of the Bulk Challenge, the dilapidated Nigerian freighter that set sail against all odds with thousands of Liberian refugees fleeing the war on May 5, 1996. We will then track the ship's journey in the dangerous waters of the Atlantic Ocean along the coast of West Africa as it danced with death. The Freeport of Monrovia hummed with restless energy. The city was consumed with carnage and confusion. Many of its residents had been running around in circles for weeks in search of safety and shelter. Shell-shocked from the intensity of the recent street fighting in the Liberian capital, many did not know where to go. They just followed the crowd intuitively. After many days of coming face to face with death, word had filtered through that the Freeport of Monrovia offered hope. It was the part of the port where ECOMOG, the West African peacekeeping force, was stationed. Factional fighters would think twice before venturing directly into the base of a well-armed multinational army. The roaming crowds wasted no time in converging here, and for now, it was a safe haven. Some of those trying to survive the onslaught came to the port early in the morning and left by evening, but many others made this place their home. Those who could afford rented shipping containers and turned them into temporary living quarters. In addition to providing safety, the port also offered food, a hustle ground for daily hire workers, and a marketplace for peddling all kinds of goods, many of which were looted. For those who hoped to escape the violence for good, the port also promised the means to do so. There were empty ships loitering in the waters, anxious to capitalize on the desperation of the swarming crowd. When it was announced that the Bulk Challenge would be taking passengers, hope blossomed into possibility. Freedom was a mere 3-day boat ride to Ghana, or so it seemed. Then the anxious waiting began. No date was given for departure, only a promise, but a promise that gave a whole new meaning to hope. After some days of restless anticipation, the crew began to sell tickets to prospective passengers. A ticket sold for $75 to $100 United States dollars per person. It looked simple on paper. Pay your money, get your ticket, get called to load your luggage, and afterwards board for departure. However, in practice, the process lacked transparency and order. There were ECOMOG soldiers on board the ship, and it appeared like they were in charge. They operated parallel to what the crew was doing. Some of what they did reeked of flagrant disregard for the safety of the people whom they claimed to be helping. They were taking bribes and allowing many passengers to circumvent the registration process. It made life difficult for those who legitimately paid for their passage. There were family heads who purchased tickets for a large number of family members. They constantly commuted between the ship and the dock to ensure that they and their loved ones would not be left behind. Meanwhile, their family members waited on land until it was time to go. When that would be was anybody's guess. The crew had to first load all their belongings onto the ship. They waited with a bated breath as the situation in the city became more volatile by the day. They wanted to get out now. After many more days of waiting, the loading began. Huge piles of luggage and other cargo turned up. It took days of feverish efforts to get everything into the hold. It was finally time to leave. When boarding began, the fight for survival turned the place into total chaos. A tsunami of people rushed into the ship. Those bypassing the legitimate process seemed more than those who had bought tickets. It became apparent that the ship was being dangerously overloaded. Many ticket holders did not stand a chance, especially those with large families with children and frail elderly travelers. They were clustered on the dock, waiting to be called. That call never came for so many of them. Unscrupulous crew members, greedy eco-mog soldiers, and their illicit clients took over the show. Many of the passengers had begun to climb onto the side of the ship, encouraged by their exploiters. It dawned on the ticketed family heads that they and their loved ones would not be making the trip. They were being scammed. There and then they began to find a way to get a refund. The corrupt security personnel were bent on preventing that. They beat the complainants with batons and belts and attempted to muscle them off the ship. A riot was brewing. Many of the passengers were peaceful citizens, but they had all been conditioned by exposure to extreme violence. There was no telling how some would react when pushed against the wall. They were definitely being pushed against the wall. The captain moved quickly to diffuse the growing tension and prevent a full eruption of discontent. He was smooth. "Listen, everybody," he said in a feigned, polite voice. "We will ensure that everyone who has bought a ticket will not be left behind. We are about to conduct a sweep. Anyone without a ticket will be asked to disembark. After that, our legitimate clients will board for us to begin our journey. Therefore, we ask that all ticket holders kindly step off so that we can clear the ship of stowaways." It was a diabolical lie. It was all part of the scheme. Even as he spoke, the crew had begun to weigh anchor for an imminent departure. Aggrieved passengers who hesitated for a moment were rudely separated from their families as the ship chugged out to sea. The captain was a dishonest man. He and his henchmen had just executed a plan to swindle the refugees from their hard-earned money. Money many of them could hardly afford. Such wickedness. How far was this captain willing to go to deepen the misery of the refugees? What else was he hiding up his sleeve? What was he thinking about overloading a ship like that with no ample supplies on board? Was he knowingly putting these people in harm's way just for the love of money? It would soon become clear that there was something sinister about this ship that would expose these hapless refugees to mortal danger, far more than they could have imagined, for a journey that seemed so simple and straightforward. With no suspicion of any foul play, they desperately hung on to the belief that once they left Liberian soil, everything would be all right. It was a classic case of jumping from the fire into the frying pan. As the vessel lumbered to sea, a strange silence fell on its doomed occupants. While some quietly celebrated their escape to freedom, others were rattled by contempt for the crew and sadness for leaving their families in harm's way. About an hour into the journey, the ship abruptly stopped. It was accosted by a speeding tugboat. The passengers were anxious to know why. The boat had brought 2 additional passengers. They were 2 of the key perpetrators of the conflict. Alhaji G.V. Kroma, the leader of the Ulimo K warring faction, and Jukonti Thomas Wowiyu, co-founder, former defense minister, and spokesperson of Taylor's NPFL faction. Why were they here? Where were they going? Were they running to save their own skin after setting the city on fire? The Americans had recently facilitated the escape of another of the architects of the conflicts, Roosevelt Johnson. He had run to the United States Embassy for shelter when he was cornered by opposing forces. They had helped to airlift him to a neighboring country. Well, if these warlords could not find safety in the midst of their own fire, who could? After Kroma and Tom Wowiyu boarded, the ship finally embarked on its fateful journey. Away in the distance, dark smoke billowed over the city as the street battles raged on, unabated. The journey proceeded in an unusual way right from the beginning. Instead of moving out to sea to briskly tackle the 600-plus nautical miles to Accra, the ship gave a subtle hint of its hidden problems. It moved slowly in shallow coastal waters, heading east of Monrovia. Traveling closer to the coast was dangerous. The ship could be shot at by fighting forces on land. The trigger-happy teenagers toting guns that were sometimes bigger than themselves have been launching RPGs like it would go out of style. There were soldiers on board the ship who were aware of that kind of danger. So why were they taking such a risk? As the ship lagged on its course, the passengers began to ask questions. They had been given assurance that they would arrive at their destination in Ghana in 3 days. Yet, after 3 days since departure, the ship was still waddling in Liberian territorial waters. Many of the voyageurs had already exhausted their meager food and water supplies. They had not planned for a longer trip. In addition to the slow pace of their travel, they had begun to notice the water level rising closer to the deck. In fact, they could touch the sea with their outstretched hands. And it was not because of surging waves. The sea was calm. What was happening? It was not long when the revelation came. It was brutal. The ship was sinking. There was a big hole underneath that was leaking aggressively. The ship's woes were complicated by the excess weight on board. Its capacity was 1,500 persons, but it was carrying an estimated 4,000 persons, in addition to the tons of things in its hold, which included cars, railroad tracks, and many other looted items. ECOMOG had gained notoriety for looting to the point that Liberians had given a new meaning to the acronym. According to Migration News, Volume 3, Number 6, Liberians renamed the peacekeeping group "Everything That Could Move Is Gone," a reference to the peacekeepers' tendency to strip Liberia of everything from its mineral wealth to factory equipment. There were, apparently, stolen UN vehicles and equipment on the bulk challenge ship. With this disclosure, the rationale behind the captain's decision to sail closer to the shore instead of in deep waters now made perfect sense. In case the ship went down, crew members and passengers who could swim would be able to save themselves. The revelation also exposed something dark about the man Roland Pudi. He was aware of the problem, but was willing to gamble with the lives of thousands of people for a few dollars. When he was confronted by journalists, he played the blame game with a straight face. According to the Associated Press, the ship's captain, Roland Pudi of Nigeria, has denied wrongdoing and said African peacekeepers in Liberia forced him to accept the passengers, despite the freighter's mechanical and structural problems. Something needed to be done fast. If not, the ship would soon plunge to the depth of the ocean, taking thousands of its passengers with it. The passengers were suddenly confronted with the stark reality of their predicament. They had run from the guns, only to be killed by the ocean on which they depended to get to safety. The feeling of impending doom hung over them like rain clouds, as everyone sought the face of God to save them from the looming calamity. The deck soon became a house of prayers. Fortunately, they were not far from the Ivorian seaport of San Pedro. The crew began to reach out to the Ivorian government to allow the vessel to dock for repair works to be done. As the passengers clustered around portable radio transmitters to hear from the outside world, they found some comfort in the fact that their story had reached the outside world, and humanitarian organizations were advocating on their behalf. However, they learned from the BBC that the Ivorian government was not permitting the ship to dock for security reasons. It was reported that the warlord, Charles Taylor, had said that there were many combatants on board the ship. Every West African nation was watching Liberia with an eagle's eye. No one wished to become another Sierra Leone, where it is believed that Liberian rebels had helped to start a war. It was a battle against time and physics. As more water entered the ship and increased its weight, the closer the deck got to the water. The passengers were beginning to panic. Hope was fading fast. In its place, something as dark as hell. They despaired, bit their nails, prayed, and despaired again. MSF, the French medical NGO, had taken personal interest in the story of the bulk challenge. They were familiar with Liberia, with the ship's story. They had their boat following the ship and updating the world on the rapidly evolving crisis. Pressure mounted on the Ivorian government to do something. As the ship waited on the edge of San Pedro and the passengers imagined death by drowning, the miserable night dragged on. When morning finally came, it was a good morning. Ivorian authorities agreed to allow the ship to dock for repair works only. The passengers snapped back to life. Hope winked its eyes once more. They started to harbor thoughts of taking a walk of sweet relief in the city, but there was no guarantee. The authorities were taking no chances. They would only allow the passengers on the dock into a designated space barricaded by 2 stories of 40-foot containers guarded by well-armed security personnel. Ordinary Ivorians were generous. They came in their numbers to empathize with the refugees, the boat people whose plight had seized the airwaves of late. The security personnel did not allow them close to the ship. All they could do was throw the items they had brought overboard, hoping somebody would grab them. When the passengers were finally allowed to disembark, access to the well-wishers was minimal and rigidly controlled. The citizens had brought them more supplies: water, bread, and first aid kits. Unfortunately, it was just a drop in the ocean. For 9 grueling hours, technicians and engineers worked assiduously in teams to fix the ship. Some pumped the water out, while others patched the hole. All the goods in the hold were by then drowned in seawater. Damaged goods. At least the passengers were safe and would not have to worry about drowning as a result of leakage. During the stay at San Pedro, it is reported that about 200 of the passengers forced themselves into an MFS barge that had pulled along the ship. They refused to leave it and left the authorities with no alternative but to yield to their protest. They agreed to screen them for awarding them refugee status. A lady and her daughter wandered far from the dock when they had the opportunity to slip through security into town. By the time they got back, the ship had left. Unfortunately, the woman had left her frail elderly mother on board of the ship by herself to endure what lay ahead without family support.